I left the United States 13 years ago, and I've never been back. Roll that intro. Hello there, I'm Rafael de Furia, back at it again for another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter, a almost somewhat special episode, at least special to me, because today, the day that this video is going to be released, is officially the day that my life began abroad 13 years ago. It's crazy to think about. I had arrived into my new life on the 1st of April, 13 years ago. What I can say, just from that one little piece though, definitely don't plan a life-changing event around April 1st. Kind of sets the tone for at least a little bit of the portion just thereafter. But today, I wanted to talk about kind of why I left and go into kind of also maybe a little bit how I've changed, a little bit of what I've noticed about people from my country that I grew up in. And then also after all this time, how I see things. Why did I leave? Am I planning to go back? Am I going to keep my citizenship? In this day and age, there are a lot of people who are giving up their American citizenship. And in the expat conversation, whether you keep your citizenship or not always seems to come up, especially with some of the dual citizenship conversations. But that's something I've never really talked about here in this YouTube channel in over 200 episodes. And then also in these 13 years, have I missed America? Do I still miss America? Do I plan to go back, or why I plan to go back, or why I don't plan to go back? And like I said, some of the things that I've noticed since being abroad. But just before we get into the rest of this episode, I want to say a huge thank you to the patrons who help to make these episodes possible on a monthly basis. Thank you also very much for your support to be able to continue, as well as the one-time donations, and also thanks to those of you who've bought the shirts, mugs, onesies, and more. And just a little comment question for this week for here on YouTube. Of course, if you're listening to this as an audio-only podcast, feel free to come on over to YouTube. But the question is, in 13 years from now, where do you hope to see yourself? What do you hope your life might look like? Do you think or hope to be in your own country? Or do you hope to be somewhere else in the world? And if so, where? But to really jump into the rest of this episode, one thing that I have to say that I feel is always misunderstood. Because I left the US and I've never been back, there always seem to be some assumptions about me, my positions, who I am, why I left, and all of these reasons. Just to go through the list, I didn't leave for any political reasons. I didn't leave for any economic reasons. I didn't leave because I was escaping from something. I don't have negative feelings about the country that I come from. I actually am very proud and grateful for the opportunities that the country that I grew up in gave me. I'm so grateful that, well, at least on one side of my family, my ancestors were able to come there, make a life. And then on the other side of my family, one of my parents actually immigrated to the US. And so all of these people having come to a new country gave me the opportunity to actually grow up in a country where I could have a better life than I would have had otherwise if I had grown up in other parts of the world. I don't know if I would have had some of those same experiences growing up that I did. And the reason why I haven't been back is not because of any ill will or any distaste or whatever. It's just, it actually ends up getting into the reason why I left was because I felt as though there was a lot more to see. There are a lot of really awesome things about the country I grew up in, but for me, I always knew growing up that at some point I would leave the USA. It was actually something that my family had talked about for years, but just really the opportunity never presented itself. The timing was never right. For various reasons, it never ended up happening. And at that point, when I had left America, my plan was actually to end up in Italy. And my hope was that my Italian citizenship would go fast and that I would be able to go there and potentially go to high school, university, kind of finish those things out in Italy. But with how things went, that wasn't the case. My citizenship ended up taking a lot longer than it really should have. But even though there was this huge delay, I took that as an opportunity to go and explore more, to live in different places, to see different places, to meet different people and cultures and experience these different things. And the food, oh yes, the food. This was, even though it was a difficult time, I had to make the best of it. So that's what I did. I mean, I didn't get my citizenship finalized until about 5 years ago, which was when I had moved to Italy full time. But like I said, I've never actually gone back to visit the United States. I've never gone to move back. I never have had that plan. However, I will say there were many times that I did consider the possibility. But in the end, when weighing everything out, it just didn't seem like the right choice. But then there's the other question, do I plan to go back? I can't say that I do. The reason why for me is, again, because there's so much to explore outside of the US. And also, I don't have a lot of family back in the US anymore. A lot of my closest family members and a lot of my extended family are outside of the US or are no longer with us. So I don't feel necessarily that same emotional pull. There were a few years at the beginning, really the most difficult, but that was also a point where I still hadn't necessarily gotten over that the life that I left in the US didn't exist anymore. And that's one thing when you move abroad, you have to consider that it is a choice. Things will never be the same. You can go abroad for a trip, but you will always have something in you that is different than where you were before. You keep on growing and adding on to this person who you are. Not necessarily that you're better or worse or this or that than anybody else. It's just your experience has broadened in a different way. And so sometimes, even to connect with people where you are from, you end up growing apart. I mean, even if you don't go to another country, but say you go to another state, you end up naturally drifting apart. And this is totally okay. This is part of life. And that was something that took me a little while to properly realize, and to realize that I had actually already made a life for myself abroad and already had a life where I was living. I had friends there. I had made a life for myself. I was doing things. I was studying. I was working. I was thising. I was thating. It wasn't the same as where I had grown up. And that part of my life, once I had realized that was over and could move past that, then that was when I really started even enjoying life abroad even more so. It's not that I don't miss America now. It's that I more miss what I had. And that point in my life, the people that were around me, the friends that I had, I miss those moments. But is that something that you can go back for? No, it's gone. The past is the past, and that's where it belongs. And yeah, there are maybe some things like some junk food that I miss or some candy from America that I miss, but I've noticed actually over time, having been abroad, especially for this chunk of a time, this large chunk of a time, that actually my tastes have changed as well. Yeah, I've gotten older as well, but I actually gotten older now. That's the thing. I left America with a full head of hair, no grays, no whites, nothing. Now, gray hair, white hair, it's all coming in. Hairline fading. But that's the thing. Those are things that don't necessarily change. Maybe some of the stresses that I had of living abroad brought some of those things on earlier, but impossible to say for sure. It was definitely a surprise when in my early 20s, some white started peeking through. But now it's just pepper on the sides. But anyway, there is that one point that I mentioned earlier about giving up American citizenship. This is something that a lot of people do think about. And for many people, I would say it's not necessarily worth it. If you're maybe somebody who's like me and who's never gone back to the country and you don't really have a major connection to the country, then maybe there's a reason there. And so actually for me, is this something that I've thought of? Yes. Is it something that I'm going to do? I don't know. It's also quite expensive. It is not cheap by any means. And I always feel as though there's the immediate response that so many people have, but you should keep it because of an emergency or this or that or the other. You know, I mean, the US isn't necessarily the best place in every aspect. It's not always the safest. And even since I've left, some places that I would consider quite safe growing up are no longer that way or have completely changed in one direction or the other. So even if I'm thinking, to hold on to the citizenship for a rainy day in case I need to go back for safety, I don't know. I don't know if that's necessarily a reason that I can personally hold on to anymore. And then there's another response that always seems to come up whenever I hear somebody talking about maybe giving up their citizenship is that, well, what about your children? What if they want to live in America? What if they want to this or what if they want da? What about your children, your future children? Well, they're not here now. And so I can say I don't have any children. Will I someday? Maybe. It would be nice. I would actually like to. But I do think there are some aspects, especially if they choose themselves that they have no interest in living in that part of the world. There are some aspects of being American that are a bit of a annoyance at times, especially when dealing with certain aspects of life during certain official documents. And that's a different discussion for a different day. But you can look up the term accidental Americans, people who didn't know that they were American from a fiscal perspective. And so even though, yeah, it's possible if I have kids that they might have an interest in it, there's also the possibility they might not have the interest in it. So I have to take that into consideration. And I do have another citizenship. So it's not like I would be a stateless person or that my children would be stateless either. So I am very fortunate in that regard. And yes, there are still some wonderful things that the United States has to offer, but are they enough and are they worth it enough that it's worth to take that gamble or that chance that could leave any potential children that I have on the hook for something that they might not be interested in? But like I said, for the time being, that's something that I don't necessarily know if I will do, in fact, because it's a big process that you have to go through and it's not cheap. Do I feel as though I am in a position where it actually would make sense to give it up? Yes, I do, in fact, believe for me personally that it actually might make more sense to give that citizenship up. And again, another thing that comes up when this topic of citizenship comes up, there's so many people from all around the world who want to go to America and they're trying to get in, they can't get in, and you're just going to give it up. And I realize I'm getting maybe a bit more political here than I would like to, and a lot more political than I normally get in any of these episodes. But I have to say, from a very practical perspective, just looking at things black and white, and no, I'm not talking about race, but like on paper, just black and white text, just when you look at some of the points, the bullet points, it's not the same place and it doesn't offer the same things that it did in the past, in my personal opinion. Yes, it does still offer a lot of wonderful things, and there are people coming from parts of the world where that is a major upgrade for them, for their quality of life, and that they have a lot more potential in a country like the United States. But for me personally, I don't know if I would be able to reach my full potential in the United States. And that's not a knock on the US. That's just where I stand personally. So I hope that there's nobody that takes this in any kind of personal way, because it's not meant as that at all. This is just me reflecting without emotion to some things that I've seen over the years. But on that topic of things that I have seen over the years, and just the, I guess you could say, paradigm shift. I hate to use that term, but really that shift in reality from living in the United States to changing out for a life in a completely different part of the world. There are lots of things that I can say that I've noticed over the years, that we do grow up in a bubble of sorts, because even culturally and linguistically, the US is the US. For the most part, and I'm going to be painting with a very broad brush here, the main languages you may come across would be English and Spanish. Granted, okay, in Quebec, you would come over Quebecois, like French, Canadian French. And there are other languages that have been brought over to North America from the immigrants who have made the country the place that it is today. So it's not like you only hear English, you only hear Spanish, but just painting a very broad brush here, those are probably going to be the languages that you're most likely to come across. But even then, we're talking about, in North America, we're talking about 3 countries here. And so living in that part of the world, there's not necessarily as much variance and change from one place to another. I mean, even in the United States, you can travel for hundreds of miles down the highway and you see one town that looks almost exactly like another town with the same strip mall and same fast food joints and same thrift shop and pawn shop, liquor store, whatever. And it all is very reminiscent of a place that you saw a few hundred miles back. Granted, there are differences from the Northeast to the West Coast, to the center of the country, to the South. There are these differences, but culturally, when you look at the US, there's a lot more similarity in many ways than differences, in my personal opinion. Again, this is just my personal viewpoint, than what you might have in let's just use Europe as an example, because I think actually it's a fantastic example of what you can see in that same few hundred miles. You could have traveled through a few different countries at the very least. And in those few countries, you could have traveled through areas that speak a dozen different languages and dialects. This is something really to consider. I mean, even in some parts of Europe, you can find places on one side of the bridge, they speak one language, and on the other side of the bridge, they speak another language. And on both sides, they have different cultures that are represented there. So you have a lot more available in a lot smaller of an area. And again, I'm not saying one is better or one is worse. I just think it's interesting. To me, it adds a little bit more spice, a little bit more fun that you can have, a little bit more of a cultural experience that you can explore. Whereas I didn't feel as though I would have that same opportunity inside of the US itself. Even though, yeah, you can go to Chinatown, little Korea, little Italy, little this, little that, little the other. But why go to the little place when you can go maybe to the big place? That's just kind of where I stand. Like, for example, if I'm really in the mood for schnitzel and I'm really craving it, theoretically, if I wanted, I could hop on a plane for like 30 euros and be in Austria or Germany in a few hours. Like, that's the other thing. Like, actually, in this part of the world, travel is quite cheap by comparison, at least by plane. I mean, you have some of the discount airlines that if you're just traveling with a backpack or less, you can find flights for 5 euros, international flights, cheap flights. I mean, maybe not 5 euros anymore, but years ago, you definitely could, especially when I first left the US. But even now, you can still find some of these really crazy deals, especially if you're flexible on the location that you're wanting to travel to. But let me get back to the point that I was making, this bubble that exists in North America. I remember having this thought myself, and I know a lot of other people who have had or still have, or even expats that I've met who are just coming off the boat, so to speak. There's this expectation that everything works the same way as it does in your home country. And this is not something that's unique to the United States or to Americans. This happens with people from all parts of the world, that we just have this expectation that's what's normal and everyday for us is normal and everyday for other people as well. But really, even so much more so with people from the US, I noticed there's this sentiment of that this is the right way and this is the way that everybody should be doing it as well. And so that's something that I can't say I gel with personally. And yes, of course, I am very much generalizing and very much painting with a very broad brush here. But again, these are just some things that I've noticed over the years. But I think there's also a term that is often used in the US that really kind of gives an idea of the mentality that is uniquely American, that doesn't necessarily find its way to other countries, and the sentiment isn't necessarily shared by other groups and other nations. But the leaders of the free world, that is a term that I can only say I've really ever heard from American media or from American politicians or American individuals. But what is the free world and who is leading it? I think that could be up for debate. Yes, I would argue definitely that the US has a major economic role in the world as a whole, but the leaders, that's interesting. That's definitely an interesting point, but it's not a position that other countries agree with. I mean, there are parts of the world where being American, it's like, oh, wow, hey, you're American. Whoa, that's so cool. I've only heard of Americans in the movies. But then there are other parts of the world that, oh, American. Like, you find a mixture of the two. And I've had both of those experiences. I'll never forget when I was in Brazil as a kid. I went there, and this, I don't remember how many years ago, but this was during the Bush era. And I'll never forget that it was during the Bush era, because when I was there, my father happened to bump into some guys at a restaurant that he knew from way back in the day, and they got chatting, and I didn't speak any Portuguese at the time, and the guys didn't speak English, but they were trying to be friendly and welcoming to their friend's kid who's a gringo from another country. But they're like, yeah, he's one of us, but he doesn't speak like us, but let's make him feel welcome. So they were trying to connect with me on some level. So their way of trying to connect with me as a kid was Clinton, good. Hey, we like Clinton. Hey, yeah. That was their way at the time, that they actually had a very positive opinion of that president. But at that time, I can't say I was necessarily politically minded or had fully formed opinions on any politician, especially because the Clinton era had been when I was a child. So, yeah. Then there are other situations, like I was on a border town in France, like right up against the border of Switzerland, and I can say I had a very negative interaction with some French there saying, ugh, Americain, blah, blah, blah. I don't remember the exact words that they used, but definitely some very negative sentiments about Americans were stuffed into what they were saying. But then there are parts of the world where I have traveled to and have actually, for safety, hid the fact that this is where I'm from. When I was on a tour, for example, and they didn't think that I was from the US, and I saw there were some other people with the group, those Americans, or the people who said they were American, did get harassed. And this was by people within the tour company. So there are times certain things can happen as an American. Being American is not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but being American and the perception of Americans definitely is interesting. I've seen in certain cases that I've been treated a certain way because of the passport that I have at like customs immigration over somebody who maybe had another passport, and that I was let into certain countries more easily than some friends that I have that are holders of other passports. Or even when moving and trying to rent an apartment, there's often an assumption that Americans really are very well off and do well for themselves. And so, oh, wow, yeah, an American tenant, that would be great. He's not going to have a problem to pay. Thank God. That hasn't necessarily been the case, even though there were moments that I definitely struggled. But I can say that I am past that point in my life. But still, there are those moments where there is this kind of street cred, for lack of a better term, that comes along with being American. But even when I think of myself, who I am, what I am, America is what I grew up in. I am American in very many ways, but at the same time, because of the people that I grew up around, it was a very international community, and even my family, there are many ways that I feel very separated. And even there are times when I can say there is a bit of a cultural barrier that I experienced growing up, and actually since leaving the country, I can say there's definitely a difference between Americans who've been abroad for a long time versus Americans who have just hopped off the boat. It's almost like a development process in a way. And I'm not trying to talk down on anybody, but there's a difference between what the US was 13 years ago versus what it is today. And so I've noticed even people who left way before I did have certain political or cultural leanings that differ from my own, which also differ from people who maybe left within the last year or so. Something that I've noticed from expats and immigrants, whatever you want to call, whatever you want to use for that word, of a person who's left their country for whatever reason that it may be, they are a representation of where their country was at the time that they left. And I can say I've met people from certain parts of the world that they left before a certain point in time, and that there is a cultural difference that they have seen between themselves and also the people who stayed maybe after 50 years, 30 years, 20 years. There is not a wedge, but there's a diversion. It's almost like a fork in the road where you both have the same origins, at least in a sense, but you move off in different directions. And this gets back to the point that I was talking about before with those friends that I had. We've just gone off in different directions in our lives. There's nothing bad, nothing good. It's grown apart. But definitely when you're abroad, it's almost too easy to tell who's an American walking around. The way they dress, the way they carry themselves, the way they act. And this is without even hearing anybody opening up their mouth. But you can often spot an American from a mile away. And that's unfortunately sometimes why there are a lot of Americans who do get targeted for certain scams while they're abroad, is because they're very easy to pick out of a crowd. But again, it kind of comes back to the way that you present outwardly towards the world. Some people will make certain assumptions about you, and based on how you maybe dress or you carry yourself physically, like your body language, or even how you take care of yourself, people might make certain assumptions about you. Yeah, we may not like it in this modern age of 2022, but assumptions are still very much a part of the human experience, even if there is a negative that can come from that. And so even I can quite confidently say there is definitely something to be said about certain American stereotypes abroad about loud, dressing a certain way, and large. And I don't mean height-wise. But really, I hate to get into that, and I don't want to make anybody feel bad in any kind of way. But it is good to know about these things so that if you don't want to be picked out as an American and you don't want to stand out from the crowd, it's important to understand what makes people stand out and what is the kind of normal uniform for how people dress from a certain country. In different parts of the world, you'll notice that there are certain trends that exist, that people of a certain age dress a certain way, certain colors. I mean, even here I can say in Portugal, for example, where I live now, you don't see a lot of huge, bright colors. You'll see a lot of darker, muted tones. And even I was out yesterday walking around here in Braga, and there was a woman who had this bright orange jacket on and bright orange boots to match, and her mask that she was wearing was also orange. This was a pretty big statement, and I feel as though maybe there are some parts of the world where big, colorful outfits like that might not be as big of a statement. Definitely it's a statement wherever you are, but just to kind of get that point across. But there are certain norms that people do adhere to. And even in Italy, this is very much the case. Dressing a certain way and taking care of yourself in a certain way. There are things that Italians do in a different way than even what Portuguese or Spanish or Germans or Austrians, Swiss, wherever you go, there is a culture around not just interactions with people, not just popular culture, but around how you express yourself as well. Things don't necessarily work the same way as they do in your country, but I think this is actually where I'm going to round things out. So thank you. Well, I should have probably put my phone on silent, but anyway, thank you all so much for joining me for another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter. Of course, a huge thank you to those of you who've supported this project through Patreon, one-time donations, the shirts, mugs, onesies, and more. Really, thank you also very, very much. Of course, if you're interested in helping to support this project to be able to continue, the links are down below in the more info section here on YouTube. But also to everybody, thank you so much for joining me, for marking my 13th year abroad, for being part of this, and for those of you who've been a part of this project in one way or another, whether you're following along and just watching in the background, or that you've been commenting and actually interacting and giving feedback to the project. Really, thank you all so very much for being part of this journey of Not Your Average Globetrotter and what it has become. It's really been an awesome experience and really the highlight of my 13 years abroad. So thank you for all being a part of this, from those small ways to the larger ways. Really, thank you. Of course, I am Rafael de Furia. This has been another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter. Stay safe and healthy out there, and I'll see you all next time. Later.